She walked into that arena like she was walking into a funeral. Black dress, mud on her boots, hair barely pinned, and that stallion, 1,200 pounds of fury and fire, had already thrown 4 men into the dirt that afternoon. But she didn't look at the horse with fear. She looked at him the way a woman looks at something she recognizes, something broken in the same places she was. And then she whispered, and the entire crowd stopped breathing. Before we get into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do something so quiet, so still, and yet felt like you were witnessing the loudest thing you'd ever seen? Because that's exactly what happened here. This isn't a story about horses, not really. It's about grief that has nowhere left to go, and what happens when it finds something wild enough to hold it. If you've ever lost something, or someone, you loved without warning, this story is going to reach into your chest. Drop a like if you're already feeling it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The county of Harland sits in the eastern corner of Wyoming, where the flatlands finally give up pretending and buckle into rugged, wind-scoured hills. It's the kind of place where the sky feels too big and the distances between neighbors feel intentional, not rude, just honest. People out there measure trust in decades, not conversations. Nora had lived there her whole life. She was 43 years old, with hands that told the story better than her face ever would. Calloused palms, a faded scar along her left thumb from a fence wire that had caught her at 17. Crow's feet that deepened whenever she smiled, which, for the better part of the past 8 months, she hadn't done much of. Her husband, Callum, had died in late October of the previous year. A combine accident, the kind of thing that happens in seconds and takes years to process. He'd been out on the Northfield alone, nothing unusual about that, and by the time anyone found him, the afternoon had already turned to dusk. They had been married 19 years. They had one daughter, a 10-year-old named Wren, who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which meant she was going to be just fine and absolutely exhausting to raise. After Callum died, Nora did what women in that part of the world often do. She kept going. She fed the animals. She signed the papers. She sat through the casseroles and the condolences and the well-meaning neighbors who said things like, "He's in a better place," in that particular tone that makes grief feel like an inconvenience. She did not cry at the funeral. She cried 3 weeks later, alone in the equipment shed, with the door latched and a flashlight still burning from when she'd gone in to look for something she couldn't even remember anymore. The farm was hers now. 42 acres of dry grass and old fence, and a barn that needed a new roof on its south side. She managed it. She was competent in the way that people who've had no choice become competent, quietly, grimly, without ceremony. What she did not do was go to the Harland County fairgrounds, not for 8 months, because the fairgrounds had been Callum's territory. He'd volunteered there since he was a teenager, helped run the rodeo circuit that rolled through every spring and summer. He knew every rancher, every rider, every horse by name. He'd grown up smelling of sawdust and leather and sun-baked dirt, and so had their marriage in ways neither of them had ever needed to articulate. Going back there meant something. Nora wasn't ready for what it meant. But then May came, and with it came the letter. The Harland County Equine Rescue, a small operation that Callum had donated to for years, quietly, without making a fuss about it, reached out to tell her that they had a horse. A stallion, actually. Coal black, 5 years old, unbroke, nearly feral, and recently surrendered by a rancher up near Sheridan who'd tried everything he could think of and hadn't been able to get within 10 feet of the animal without it rearing and screaming. They were calling him Smoke. The letter said that they'd found Callum's name in the organization's records, that he had been a sustaining donor, that they wanted to invite Nora to an open day at the fairgrounds, a community event, part fundraiser, part demonstration, where volunteers would work with some of the rescued horses. They didn't expect her to do anything. Just come, be there. Let the community hold her a little. Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she wasn't ready to throw away. It sat there for 11 days. On the 12th day, she ironed her dress, the black one, the only good one that still fit, pulled on her boots, and drove to the fairgrounds. She didn't tell Wren where she was going. She wasn't sure she could explain it. The fairgrounds were more crowded than she'd expected for a Saturday morning. Families had spread blankets on the grass near the arena fence. Kids were chasing each other through the legs of adults who held paper cups of coffee and talked about irrigation and feed prices and the weather system moving in from the northwest. A food truck was selling breakfast burritos near the main gate, and the smell of green chile and bacon fat drifted across the whole property like a welcome. Nora stood at the edge of the parking lot for a moment. Just stood there, keys in her hand, not quite ready to walk forward. A man in a straw hat waved at her from across the lot. She didn't recognize him, but she waved back. That was the thing about small counties. You didn't always need to know someone to wave at them. You just did. She found her way to the main arena and claimed a spot at the rail near the far end, away from the clusters of families, close enough to see, far enough not to be drawn into conversation. That's when she saw Smoke for the first time. He was in the far corner of the arena, separated from the activity by a temporary fence panel. Even from 30 yards away, she could see the way he held himself, not just standing, but coiled, every muscle engaged. His ears moved constantly, cataloguing threats. When a child shrieked with laughter near the fence, his whole body flinched sideways, 2 steps, then stopped. He turned his head and looked at the crowd with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but was very close to its cousin. He was the most beautiful thing she'd seen in 8 months. A man named Dex, one of the rescue volunteers, barrel-chested, mid-50s, wearing a vest with the rescue organization's logo on the back, climbed onto a small platform near the center of the arena and used a microphone to welcome everyone. He explained the mission of the rescue. He talked about the horses they'd placed that year, and then he said with the kind of practiced gravity that people use when they need a crowd to lean in. And this here is Smoke. He came to us 3 weeks ago from up near Sheridan. And I'll be honest with y'all, Smoke has not made our lives easy. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. We've had 4 of our most experienced handlers work with him, and he's been firm about his feelings on the matter. More laughter. A few kids pressed up against the rail to get a better look. Over the next hour, Nora watched 3 different handlers enter Smoke's enclosure. The first was a young man named Garrett, confident and methodical, who used a long flag on a pole, a common natural horsemanship tool, to move Smoke around the enclosure and try to establish communication. Smoke tolerated this for about 4 minutes before wheeling hard to the right and charging the fence at the opposite end, stopping just short of it, but close enough that several people in the crowd stepped back reflexively. The second handler was a woman in her 30s who came in low and quiet and patient. She made no sudden moves. She stood with her body angled sideways, a non-threatening posture. Smoke watched her from across the enclosure with those dark, restless eyes. He let her get about 15 feet away. Then he lifted his head, snorted once like a verdict, and turned his back on her. She stood there for 10 minutes. He did not turn around. The third man, older, the most experienced of the 3, someone who Dex introduced as having 30 years of rescue work behind him, lasted 7 minutes before Smoke reared up and came down close enough to rattle the enclosure fence and send the crowd gasping back from the rail. Nobody was hurt. But the message was clear. Smoke was not here for this. Nora had been watching the whole time with her arms folded on the rail, her chin resting on her forearms, like a child watching something she couldn't pull her eyes away from. She wasn't analyzing what the handlers were doing wrong. She wasn't thinking about strategy or technique or theory. She was thinking about how Smoke looked when he turned his back on the woman. Not mean, not violent, just done. The look of something that has been reached for too many times by hands it doesn't trust, and has decided that the safest thing it can do is stop letting anyone get close enough to try again. She knew that look. She'd been wearing it for 8 months. Dex was back on the platform now, talking about the rescue's upcoming fundraiser, reading off donor acknowledgements, doing the gracious administrative work of keeping the crowd engaged. A few families started drifting away toward the food truck. Nora unfolded herself from the rail. She walked toward Dex. He saw her coming and paused mid-sentence, tilting his head with a look of mild confusion, polite but uncertain. She wasn't wearing a volunteer badge. She didn't look like she had a plan. She looked like a woman in a black dress and muddy boots who had just made a decision that she was already halfway regretting. "Nora Ashby," she said when she reached him. My husband Callum used to donate." Dex's expression shifted. Recognition, then something softer. "I knew Callum," he said quietly. "Good man, I'm real sorry." "I'd like to go in with the horse," Nora said. There was a pause. "Ma'am, I'm not asking to train him. I just want to stand in there for a minute." Dex looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Smoke was pacing the far end of the enclosure in tight, agitated circles. Dex looked at the horse. He looked back at Nora. He took a breath. "You got any experience with horses?" "Grew up with quarter horses," she said. "Haven't been around one in a few years." Another pause. "I'm going to need you to sign a waiver," he said. "Fine. And if he pins his ears, you come out. No argument." "Agreed." Dex nodded slowly, in the way that men nod when they're saying yes to something they're not sure about, but can't find a clean reason to refuse. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. Word travels fast in small arenas. By the time Nora had signed the waiver, a single clipboard page handed to her by a teenager who looked nervous about the whole thing, a new cluster of people had gathered at the rail. She didn't notice them, or rather, she noticed them the way you notice weather, peripherally, without giving it much thought. Garrett, the young handler who'd gone in first, came to stand next to her as she handed back the clipboard. "You don't have to do this," he said. Not unkindly, just factual. "I know," she said. "He's not a mean horse," Garrett said. I don't know exactly what he is. He just won't let you near him." Nora nodded. She looked at Smoke, still pacing. "What do you know about where he came from?" she asked. Garrett leaned against the rail. "Rancher up near Sheridan had him from a foal. From what we understand, the first couple years were fine. Then something happened. We don't know exactly what. And after that he just shut down. Wouldn't be handled. The rancher tried a lot of things. Eventually called us." "Was he hurt?" "Vet checked him out. No physical injuries. Nothing obvious." Garrett paused. "Sometimes it's not about what happened to their body." Nora looked at the horse for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked toward the enclosure gate. Dex was waiting there. He held it open for her with a look on his face that was approximately 50% professional concern and 50% something he couldn't quite name. She walked in. The gate clicked shut behind her. "Now, pay attention here, because this is the part that the people standing at that rail said they'd never forget." Nora did not walk towards Smoke. She walked to the middle of the enclosure, maybe 30 feet from where he stood at the far end, and she stopped. She turned her body slightly to the left, not angled away from the horse, not toward him either, just sideways, neutral. And then she stood still, not with the stillness of someone waiting, with the stillness of someone who has nowhere else to be. Smoke had stopped pacing the moment the gate opened. He was watching her now from the far end, head up, nostrils wide, reading the air. His muscles were still coiled, still ready, but he hadn't moved. Nora didn't look at him directly. She looked at a point on the ground maybe 10 feet to his left, not avoiding him, just not demanding anything from him either. 30 seconds passed. A minute. A woman near the rail whispered something to her husband. He shushed her. Smoke took one step forward. Just one. Testing. Nora didn't react. He took another step. Stopped. His ears, which had been pinned flat and tight against his skull when she walked in, shifted. Not forward yet, but not flat. Something in between. A question mark, in horse language. Garrett, watching from the gate, exhaled slowly. He'd been holding his breath. Nora still hadn't moved. And then This is the part, this is the exact moment she started talking, not loud, not commanding, not in any tone that carried across the arena to the people watching. It was barely above a breath. The people at the rail said later that they couldn't hear the words, only that her lips were moving. She was talking to the horse the way you talk to someone when you've stopped trying to say the right thing. She wasn't using a method. She wasn't executing a technique. She was just talking. Smoke dropped his head, not much, an inch, maybe two. But in horse language, that inch is a paragraph. That inch means, I'm listening. That inch means, I haven't decided yet, but I'm not leaving. Nora kept talking. Nobody at the rail moved. This went on for 4 minutes, 4 long, suspended, barely breathing minutes, during which the entire atmosphere of that arena changed into something that the people present would spend years trying to describe to people who weren't there. And then Nora did something that made Dex put his hand over his mouth. She sat down. Right there in the dirt, in her black dress, she folded herself down and sat cross-legged on the ground like she was settling in for the duration, and she kept talking. Smoke stared at her. His tail moved, one slow sweep, then still again. He stretched his neck forward, nostrils working, reading her from 15 feet away. He took 3 steps toward her, stopped. 2 more. He was close enough now that the people at the rail could see the muscles along his shoulder trembling, not from aggression, but from the effort of overriding every instinct that was telling him to run. Nora tilted her head up and looked at him directly for the first time, and she whispered something, 1 sentence, maybe 2. Nobody heard the words. What they heard was the silence that came after. Smoke lowered his head all the way down, nose nearly touching the dirt just a few feet from where Nora sat, and he exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that shook his whole chest, the kind of exhale that every horse person in that arena recognized immediately. Because that sound has a name in their world. They call it a release. It's what happens when a horse finally puts down the thing it has been carrying. Someone at the rail started crying. She didn't seem to know she was doing it until her husband touched her arm. Dex had both hands over his mouth now. Garrett was gripping the fence rail with both fists, leaning forward like the last inches of distance between him and the enclosure were the only thing keeping him upright. Nora stayed perfectly still. She let Smoke take his time. He stood there with his head down for almost a full minute. Then, slowly, he shifted his weight forward. 1 hoof, another. He was now close enough that Nora could have reached up and touched his muzzle without stretching. She didn't reach. She waited. He brought his nose down to her shoulder, just rested it there, gently, like he was checking whether she was real. Nora closed her eyes. Later, much later, a woman named Phyllis, who had been standing near the right side of the rail with her granddaughter, said that watching Nora in that moment was the strangest thing. Because from outside the enclosure, from where the crowd stood, Nora didn't look like someone who had just done something remarkable. She looked like someone who had just been allowed to rest, like she'd been standing up for a very long time, Phyllis said. And finally, something held her up instead. Inside the enclosure, Nora and Smoke stayed like that for several minutes. Her sitting in the dirt, his big head resting on her shoulder, both of them completely still. Then Nora slowly raised her right hand and placed it against the side of his face. He didn't flinch. She began to move her fingers in small, gentle circles along his jaw, the way you might rub the ears of a dog who's finally decided you're safe. Smoke's lower lip went soft and loose. Another thing every horse person in the crowd recognized. Another release. Deeper this time. The crowd had gone so quiet that when Dex finally lowered his hands from his mouth and cleared his throat, 2 people jumped. Garrett turned to him. "Who is she?" he said quietly. "Widow of a man who used to support the rescue," Dex said. His voice was slightly rough. He cleared his throat again. "Lost her husband in the fall." Garrett looked back into the enclosure. He watched Nora stroking Smoke's jaw. He watched the horse standing there like a stone that has finally learned to be water. "How long has it been?" he asked. 8 months, Dex said. Garrett nodded. He was quiet for a moment. You think she knew? He asked. That was what he needed? Dex looked at Nora. He thought about it. I think she knew what it feels like, he said finally, to not be able to let anyone near you. There's something I want to say here about what Nora did and what she didn't do. She didn't use a method. She didn't have a plan. She walked into that enclosure carrying 8 months of the heaviest kind of grief, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone you can't put down. And she just brought it with her. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't armor up. She sat in the dirt in her good black dress, and she talked to a horse the way she might have talked to Callum in the dark on a sleepless night. And Smoke understood, not because horses are magical, not because grief has some mystical frequency that animals can detect, but because something that has been damaged enough, wounded enough in the places that don't show, can recognize the same damage in something else. And when it does, it doesn't feel threatened. It feels seen. Nora saw Smoke, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Smoke let himself be seen back. They stayed in the enclosure for 32 minutes. Nora didn't stand up. She didn't try to lead him anywhere, didn't put a halter on him, didn't ask for anything. She just stayed. When she finally rose, slowly, stiffly, with the dignified awkwardness of a woman who has been sitting cross-legged in arena dirt for half an hour in a dress, Smoke raised his head and watched her. She turned toward the gate. He followed her, not because she led him, not because she asked. He just followed. 3 steps behind her, all the way to the gate. And then he stopped and watched as Dex opened it and Nora walked out. Someone in the crowd started clapping. Then more people. Then nearly everyone. Nora didn't hear it. Or maybe she heard it, and it felt like something happening very far away, in a world that was slightly separate from the one she'd just been in. She walked back to the clipboard table, picked up her purse from where she'd set it, and found a quiet corner near the fence. She was shaking a little, not from fear, from something harder to name. Dex found her 20 minutes later, standing near the back fence with a paper cup of water, looking out at the hills to the east. He came and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. That was something she'd always appreciated about people out here. They could share silence without filling it. I've been doing this work for 23 years, he said finally. I've seen a lot of things happen with difficult horses. Nora nodded. I've never seen that, he said. She looked down at the cup in her hand. He was just ready, she said. I think maybe I just happened to be there when he was ready. No, Dex said, and his voice had a firmness to it that made her look up. That's not what happened. What you brought in there, whatever that was, he responded to it specifically. Garrett went in twice. He's the best young handler I've ever trained. The horse didn't give him a thing. You walked in and sat down in the dirt and that horse came to you. Nora was quiet. I wasn't trying to do anything, she said. I talked to him. What did you say to him? Dex asked. She thought about it for a moment. She turned the paper cup between her hands. I told him I knew what it was like, she said. To not want anyone near you. To not trust that letting someone in was worth the risk. She paused. I told him I was tired of feeling like that. She paused again, longer. I told him I thought maybe he was too. Dex was quiet for a while. You thinking about working with him more? He asked. She started to say no. The word formed in her mouth and then just stayed there. I don't know, she said instead. The rescue doesn't have the resources to keep a horse like him long term, Dex said. We've got 30 animals and a barn built for 20. He'd need someone with land, time, patience. He looked at her sideways. Someone who already has his trust. I have 42 acres, Nora said. Almost to herself. I know, Dex said. Callum used to talk about that place like it was the 8th wonder of the world. Something moved across Nora's face. Grief, but a gentler version of it. The kind that doesn't rip anymore, just reminds. He loved that land, she said. He did. She looked back out at the hills. Let me think about it, she said. Dex nodded. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest and handed her a card. She tucked it into her purse without looking at it. He started to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, I think Callum would have loved watching what happened in there today. Nora nodded. She didn't trust her voice right at that moment. Dex left her to the hills and the quiet. She stood there for a long time. The drive home took 40 minutes on a good road, and she spent most of it not thinking about the farm logistics, not thinking about fencing or feed costs, or the practicalities of taking on a horse that 3 experienced handlers couldn't get near. She spent it thinking about Smoke's nose on her shoulder, about the weight of it, about how something that big and that frightened had just decided, to put its most vulnerable place against a woman sitting alone in the dirt. She thought about how it felt to be trusted by something that had given up trusting. She pulled into her driveway at noon. Wren was sitting on the porch steps, eating a peanut butter sandwich, still in her Saturday morning pajamas, which meant she'd probably watched 3 hours of television and hadn't done the dishes she'd been asked to do. She looked up when Nora got out of the truck. "Where'd you go?" Wren asked. "The fairgrounds," Nora said. Wren blinked. Her mother hadn't been to the fairgrounds since. Wren did the calculation, and it showed on her face, a small, careful shift in her expression that Nora recognized as the look of a child trying very hard not to make a big deal out of something. "How was it?" Wren asked. Nora climbed the porch steps and sat down next to her daughter on the second step. "There was this horse," she said. Wren waited. "A black one, about this tall." Nora held her hand at eye level. "He didn't like anyone. Wouldn't let anyone near him." Wren took a bite of her sandwich. "What happened?" "I went in with him." Wren turned and looked at her mother fully now. "Mom, he was okay," Nora said. "More than okay." Wren studied her for a moment with those dark, calm eyes. "You smell like a horse," she said. Nora laughed. It was the first real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep enough that it surprises you, that she'd had in 8 months. It sounded a little rusty, a little unused, but it was real. Wren leaned her head against her mother's arm. Nora put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They sat on the porch steps in the noon sun and didn't say anything for a while, and it was the most okay Nora had felt since October. She called Dex on Monday. The paperwork took 3 weeks. The fencing on the north paddock needed reinforcement. 2 new posts and fresh wire along the east side. The old quarter-horse barn, which hadn't been used since before Wren was born, needed mucking out, fresh straw, and a new water trough fitting. Nora did most of the work herself. Wren helped on weekends, arriving at the barn in rubber boots and work gloves that were 2 sizes too big, asking very specific questions about horses with the focused intensity of a child who has decided that a thing is important and is now cataloging everything she can learn about it. The morning Smoke arrived, a Wednesday, 4 weeks after the fairgrounds. The sky over the farm was the particular shade of pale grey that meant weather was thinking about it, but hadn't decided yet. Dex drove the trailer himself. He had Garrett with him. When they backed the trailer up to the paddock gate, Smoke was audible before he was visible. Hooves on the trailer floor, the hollow sound of anxious movement, the occasional percussion of a shoulder against the metal wall. Nora stood at the paddock gate. Wren was on the fence about 20 feet back, positioned there by agreement, close enough to watch, far enough to be safe, with both feet on the bottom rail and her chin hooked over the top, completely still for once in her life. Dex and Garrett lowered the trailer ramp. Garrett stood to the side. He had a lead rope, but made no move toward the trailer door. He looked at Nora. Nora walked up the ramp. Inside the trailer, Smoke stood with his back against the far wall, nostrils flared, every muscle rigid. He'd been loaded into this trailer, she imagined, probably not gently, and transported 40 miles to a place he'd never been, surrounded by smells and sounds that were completely new, and his whole body was broadcasting a single clear message, which was, "I am seconds away from coming apart." Nora stepped inside the trailer. "Hey," she said, her voice low and even. Smoke's ears flicked toward her. He recognized the voice. She saw the exact moment he registered it, a fractional softening around his eye, a slight forward shift of his ears from their tightly flattened position. "It's okay," she said. "I've got you." She stood there for a moment, not moving, letting him recalibrate. Then she stepped to the side of the trailer and unclipped his lead from the tie ring, and she walked backward down the ramp without hurrying, without looking behind her for the ground, trusting her feet to find it. Smoke watched her back down the ramp. Then he followed. One slow step at a time, down the ramp and into the paddock, blinking in the grey morning light, reading the new world, the smells of the grass and the old fence posts and the far-off cattle and the particular quality of silence that a 42-acre farm has when it's not yet fully awake. He stood in the middle of the paddock and he turned in a slow circle. Nora let him. Wren, 20 feet away on the fence, was absolutely silent and absolutely still in the way that children are when they understand, instinctively without being told, that this is a moment that requires stillness. Smoke completed his circle. He looked at the fence line, looked at the barn, looked at the hills beyond the farm. Then he turned and looked at Nora, and he walked to her. No hesitation. He just walked across the paddock and stopped in front of her and dropped his head and put his nose against her chest. "Oh," Wren breathed from her fence post. Not loud, just a sound, like something inside her had shifted. Garrett, standing by the trailer, pressed his lips together and looked up at the sky for a moment in the way that men who have been in this work for a long time sometimes do when they're feeling something they weren't prepared for. Nora had both hands on either side of Smoke's face now. She was talking to him again, that same low, barely audible stream of words that nobody ever fully heard. It went on like that for a while. The hardest part came 6 days later. Smoke had been settling, better than any of them had hoped, better than Dex's experience said was likely, better than the cautious optimism Nora had let herself feel. He'd been eating well. He let Nora brush him. He'd allowed her to put a halter on him twice, without incident. On the 7th day, Nora tried to lead him into the barn, not to confine him, just to walk him through it, familiarize him with the space. He made it 3 steps through the door, and then something, a shadow, a sound, something internal that Nora would never be able to identify, tripped the wire in him. He reared, not a warning rear. A full, vertical, terrifying rear, 1,200 pounds going straight up, with a scream that sent the nearby starlings out of the elm tree in a black exploding cloud. Nora dropped the lead. She had the presence of mind to step sideways, not backward, sideways, and she ended up against the barn wall with Smoke's front hooves coming down on the ground about 4 feet to her left. She stood there, back against the wall, both hands out at her sides, completely still. Smoke landed, spun, and faced the barn door. He stood there trembling, chest heaving, eyes white-rimmed and wild. Nora looked at him. She didn't approach. She didn't make a sound. She just looked at him, steady, unhurried, until gradually, over the course of maybe 3 minutes, his breathing began to slow. Then she started talking. Same voice. Same, low, unhurried tone. She talked for 5 minutes. She told him she wasn't angry. She told him she wasn't going to force him into anywhere he didn't want to go. She told him that whatever had scared him in there, she believed him. She told him she knew what it was like to walk back into a place that held something terrifying, and she knew he'd do it on his own time. "I'm still here," she told him. "I'm not going anywhere." By the end of those 5 minutes, Smoke had walked back to her. He stood in the barn doorway and let her take the lead rope from the ground. She didn't try to walk him in again that day, but the next morning she came back. She stood at the barn door and she waited, and after 20 minutes, 20 quiet, patient, undemanding minutes, Smoke walked through the door on his own. He walked in, he looked around, he walked back out, then he walked in again. That was it. No fanfare, no breakthrough moment. Just a horse deciding on his own terms that a place that had been terrifying yesterday was something he could revisit today. Nora watched him and felt something in her chest shift. She thought about walking back into the equipment shed after Callum died, the first time. How she'd stood at the door for 3 days before she could go in. How she'd finally just gone in one morning without thinking about it too hard, and it had been terrible and also, eventually, okay. She thought, "We're not that different, you and me." She reached out and laid her hand on Smoke's neck. He stood perfectly still. Summer moved across the farm the way Wyoming summer does, fast and brilliant, with that particular quality of light that turns everything slightly gold in the afternoons and makes long distances look like paintings. Nora and Smoke worked together every morning, not always in the formal sense, not always with lead ropes and halters and training goals. Sometimes she just went out to the paddock with her coffee and leaned against the fence, and Smoke came over and stood with her while the sun rose. Wren, predictably, became obsessed. She was out there every afternoon she was home, learning the language of horses, not from a book, but from proximity, from watching her mother, from the slow education of a 10-year-old who has something real to pay attention to. She learned to read his ears. She learned that the way he carried his tail told you what kind of day he was having. She learned that you don't approach a horse from behind without announcing yourself. And she learned this not from being told, but from a single startled snort from Smoke that sent her 3 steps backward and made her rethink her strategy. Smoke tolerated Wren the way that complicated animals sometimes tolerate children, warily at first, then with a kind of resigned affection, and eventually with what could only be described as mild enthusiasm for her company. He never warmed to her the way he warmed to Nora, but he let her brush his mane. He let her bring him apples from the tree at the back of the property. Once, on a particularly still evening, he let her lean against his shoulder while she read a book out loud, a chapter from a novel she was into about a girl who could talk to foxes. And he stood there for the better part of 20 minutes without moving, as if listening. Garrett came out once a week that first summer, ostensibly to check on the horse's progress and help Nora with the training foundations. In practice, he became part of the rhythm of the place. He and Nora worked well together. He was quiet and methodical and not precious about being corrected when Nora read Smoke differently than he did, which happened often and which he took as a learning opportunity rather than a slight. By August, Nora was riding Smoke, not galloping across fields. Nothing cinematic like that, just walking. Slow circles in the north paddock with no saddle, just a pad and a light bridle, both of them learning the vocabulary of weight and pressure that is the language of riding. Smoke carried her like she was the most natural thing in the world. The first time it happened, the first time she sat on his back and he simply walked forward, calm and balanced and unbothered, Nora sat up there for a long moment with the reins loose in her hands and looked out across the farm, the hills to the east, the old elm by the fence, the square shape of the house with its front porch, and the flower bed that Callum had planted the spring before he died, that she'd neglected all last year, and then, this spring, had weeded and watered back into something that bloomed. She thought Callum would have liked this horse. She thought Callum would have liked watching Wren with this horse. She thought, I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. Later that fall, Dex called her. He was putting together a presentation for a regional conference of equine rescue organizations. He wanted to talk about cases where difficult horses had been placed with unconventional adopters, people who didn't have formal training backgrounds, but who had somehow achieved results that trained professionals hadn't been able to. He wanted to include Smoke's story. If that's okay with you, he said. Nora thought about it. What would you tell them? She asked. The truth, Dex said. That I watched a woman sit down in the dirt in the middle of an arena and talk to a horse that nobody could reach, and that horse walked over and put his nose on her shoulder. And what's the lesson? She asked. For the conference? Dex was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure it's a lesson exactly, he said. I think it's more of a reminder that the things that are hardest to reach aren't usually waiting for the right technique. They're waiting for someone who knows, in their bones, from experience, what it's like to need to be reached. Nora was quiet on her end. Yeah, she said finally. You can tell the story. 2 years passed. They passed the way time does when you're no longer fighting it, in seasons and small events and the particular accumulation of ordinary mornings that eventually, when you look back, turns out to be a life. Nora turned 45. Ren turned 12. Smoke turned 7, which in horse years meant he was moving from young and volatile into something steadier, still spirited, still himself, but with an ease in his body that told you he'd found a place in the world that suited him. The farm changed some. Nora reinforced the roof on the south side of the barn, the one that had needed it for 2 years before Callum died and 2 years after. She added 2 new fence sections along the western edge of the property. She planted a second flower bed alongside the first one, this time with some input from Ren, who had opinions about marigolds that she expressed at considerable length. Garrett kept coming. This became something that nobody in the county made a fuss about, which was the best possible way for it to become something. He had his own ranch 6 miles east, a modest operation, cattle, and one aging quarter horse named Buck, who had the disposition of a very patient librarian. He and Nora moved at the pace of 2 people who have both learned the hard way that the things worth having don't need to be hurried. Ren liked him. She expressed this characteristic indirectly by asking him very pointed questions about everything he knew, and then arguing with his answers just enough to make clear she found him intellectually worthy of engagement. Smoke, after a period of careful assessment, accepted Garrett the way he accepted a few others in Nora's world, with guarded neutrality that occasionally softened into something warmer on Smoke's terms, in Smoke's time. He would never be the kind of horse that anyone could walk up to without being invited. That was simply who he was. But for those he trusted, he was extraordinary, responsive and sensitive, and present in a way that consistently caught people off guard. Nora began working informally with the rescue, not as a staff member, not in any official capacity, just as someone who would take a call when Dex had a horse that nobody could reach, and who would drive over to the fairgrounds and spend a morning in a paddock talking to something frightened until it wasn't frightened anymore. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they learned by surviving them. There was a horse in the spring of the 2nd year, a chestnut mare named by the rescue team as Thistle, who had come in from a neglect situation and who had shut down so completely she wouldn't eat if anyone was in her line of sight. Garrett said, watching Nora work with her, that it was like watching someone translate a language in real time, not from a dictionary but from having lived in it. She talks to them, Ren explained to a friend from school who came out one afternoon and watched, wide-eyed, from the paddock fence. She tells them the truth. What truth? The friend asked. Ren thought about it. That she knows, Ren said. That she's been somewhere hard too, and that she came back from it. Her friend didn't fully understand this, which was fine. She was 11. There would be time. Nora didn't know that her daughter had said this until much later, when Ren was in high school and wrote a short essay about grief for an English class assignment and used Smoke and the story of the fairgrounds that May morning as her central example. The essay ended with a line that Nora read and then had to sit down on the kitchen table and take a breath before she could pick it up and finish. Ren had written, "My mother walked into that arena carrying something very heavy. But when she walked out, it looked a little different, not lighter, just held differently, like she'd finally found something big enough to put some of it down." Nora read it again. She thought about Smoke's nose on her shoulder in the dirt, about that long, shuddering exhale, about how 2 things that are damaged in the same places will sometimes, if left alone in a quiet space long enough, find a way to make a language out of it. She took the essay and put it in the kitchen drawer, right next to the letter from the rescue, the one she'd folded and kept for 11 days before she could act on it. She didn't throw either of them away. If you stayed with this story all the way here, I want you to really sit with what Nora did that day. She walked into an arena with nothing, no training certification, no strategy, no plan. She had grief and honesty, and the willingness to sit in the dirt in her good dress and be exactly who she was, without armor, without pretense. And that was enough, maybe more than enough. I think about the people in our lives, the ones who have shut down, gone quiet, turned their backs on everyone who tries to get close, the ones who rear up when approached and pace when they're alone, and have made a kind of dark peace with the idea that nobody is ever going to reach them. I think about what Nora understood that the trained handlers didn't, that what they needed wasn't technique. It was someone who knew, in their bones, not from a textbook, what it feels like to be unreachable, and who sat down anyway, and talked, and waited. Grief does something to us that we don't always acknowledge. It makes us wilder, more unpredictable, more dangerous to approach in certain moments. But it also, if we survive it, makes us capable of a kind of understanding that has no shortcut. You can't learn it. You can only live through it. Nora lived through it. And because she did, a horse that nobody could reach found its way back to the world. That's the story. If it moved you, hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it means everything for getting these stories out to people who need them. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I put everything into these stories, and there are more on the way. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever known someone like Nora, someone who carried grief and turned it into a kind of superpower. I read every single one. Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you in the next one.